Rising suddenly from the tidal flats of Normandy, Mont-Saint-Michel appears less like a human construction and more like a vision, an island that seems to drift between earth, sea, and sky. At low tide, it stands isolated in a vast expanse of sand and shimmering water channels. Hours later, the sea surges back with dramatic speed, transforming the mount into a fortress surrounded by waves. This constant rhythm of disappearance and return has shaped how people understood the site for more than 1,000 years. Mont-Saint-Michel was never simply a place to build. It was a place that demanded interpretation, reverence, and awe. Long before stone walls and towers rose above the rock, the mount already carried sacred meaning. In the early Middle Ages, this isolated outcrop was associated with divine presence and celestial protection. According to tradition, the archangel Michael appeared to Bishop Aubert of Avranches in the early 8th century, instructing him to build a sanctuary on the rock. Whether legend or symbolic memory, the story reflects how the site was understood. Not chosen by human strategy, but claimed by heaven. From the beginning, Mont-Saint-Michel was imagined as a threshold between worlds, a place where the divine could interrupt the ordinary landscape. As the first church structures gave way to a growing monastic community, the mount evolved into one of medieval Europe's most powerful spiritual centres. Benedictine monks transformed the steep rock into a vertical monastery, carving terraces, halls, and chapels into the stone itself. Every architectural decision was shaped by constraint, limited space, violent winds, unstable ground, and the ever-changing sea below. The result was not a single design, but a layered structure, built over centuries, where Romanesque solidity and Gothic ambition coexist in dramatic tension. The abbey rises upward like a stone ladder, drawing the eye and the pilgrim toward the sky. Pilgrimage defined Mont-Saint-Michel's medieval life. Travellers crossed dangerous tidal flats on foot, guided by local knowledge and faith, always aware that mist, shifting sands, or sudden tides could mean death. The journey itself became part of the spiritual experience. Reaching the mount was proof of endurance, humility, and trust in divine protection. Once inside the walls, pilgrims encountered a world ordered by ritual. Prayer echoing through vaulted halls, bells marking time, and the constant presence of the sea as a reminder of instability beyond sacred walls. Yet Mont-Saint-Michel was never only a religious site. Its strategic position made it a natural fortress, especially during periods of war. During the 100 Years' War, the mount resisted repeated English attacks, its walls and tides forming a near-perfect defence system. Cannons failed where geography succeeded. This survival transformed Mont-Saint-Michel into a symbol not just of faith, but of resistance and identity. It stood as proof that spiritual authority and military endurance could occupy the same stone foundations. Over time, however, the sacred rhythm weakened. As pilgrimage declined and political priorities shifted, the abbey's purpose changed. After the French Revolution, Mont-Saint-Michel was stripped of its religious role and turned into a prison. Cells replaced chapels, silence replaced prayer, and the vertical structure that once guided souls upward was repurposed to confine bodies. This phase left deep marks on the site, reminding later generations how easily sacred space can be reshaped by power. The 19th and 20th centuries brought restoration, re-evaluation, and renewed respect for the mount's layered past. Scholars, architects, and historians worked to recover its medieval character while acknowledging the complexity of its history. Modern engineering projects sought to restore the natural flow of tides, reversing centuries of silting that had threatened to bind the island permanently. to the mainland. Today, Mont-Saint-Michel once again stands surrounded by moving water, its isolation restored not as nostalgia, but as meaning. Mont-Saint-Michel endures because it resists simple definition. It is at once monastery, fortress, prison, monument, and symbol. Its power lies not in perfection, but in accumulation of belief, labour, conflict, and memory. As tides rise and fall around the rock, the mount continues to embody a rare balance: human ambition shaped by nature, stone shaped by faith, and history shaped by forces far larger than any single generation. Long before Christian monks raised stone walls and towers, the tidal landscape surrounding Mont-Saint-Michel already carried religious meaning. The violent movement of the sea, the sudden isolation of the rock, and the vast openness of the bay created a setting that invited interpretation in sacred terms. For pre-Christian communities, such places were never neutral. They were understood as liminal zones, spaces where natural forces revealed the presence of unseen powers. The tides themselves appeared alive, governed by rhythms beyond human control, shaping belief long before theology gave them names. In the Roman and late antique periods, coastal sanctuaries across Gaul were often linked to local deities associated with water, boundaries, and protection. Sacred rocks, springs, and tidal flats were treated as points of contact between the human and divine worlds. While direct evidence for a pagan shrine on Mont-Saint-Michel remains limited, the logic of the landscape fits patterns seen throughout northwestern Europe. High places rising from dangerous waters were natural candidates for cult activity, ritual offerings, and stories that explained why such places demanded respect and caution. As Christianity spread through the region, it did not erase the old sacred geography. Instead, it reinterpreted it. Early Christian leaders understood that belief was anchored to place as much as doctrine. By attaching new meanings to familiar sites, they redirected existing reverence rather than attempting to destroy it. The transformation of the Mount into a Christian sanctuary followed this strategy. The power once attributed to tides and unnamed forces was reframed as the authority of a heavenly guardian, an archangel who ruled the space between earth and sky. The figure of Michael was especially suited to this role. In Christian thought, he was a warrior, a judge, and a guardian of thresholds. Shrines dedicated to him often appeared on high ground, cliffs, and isolated peaks. Placing his sanctuary on a tidal rock surrounded by dangerous waters was not accidental. The Mount became a Christian answer to older fears and wonders, offering protection where uncertainty had once ruled. The sea did not lose its power. It gained a new meaning within a Christian cosmic order. Over time, the sanctuary grew into a disciplined monastic centre, but traces of older world views never fully disappeared. The monks lived according to strict ritual schedules, yet their daily lives remained shaped by tides, storms, and seasonal rhythms. Prayer was timed not only by bells, but by the sea's movements. In this way, Christian practice absorbed the logic of the landscape rather than replacing it. Nature continued to instruct belief, even as theology provided its language. Pilgrims who approached the Mount carried with them layers of expectation, shaped by both inherited folklore and Christian teaching. Crossing the bay was an ordeal that echoed older initiation journeys, where danger itself became proof of devotion. The risk of the tides transformed travel into a ritual act, blurring the line between physical survival and spiritual trial. The sanctuary did not stand apart from this experience. It completed it, giving meaning to the fear and effort demanded by the landscape. Through centuries of worship, conflict, and reinterpretation, Mont-Saint-Michel became a living example of religious continuity rather than rupture. Pagan reverence for powerful places did not vanish. It was redirected and disciplined within Christian structures. The tides that once inspired awe in unnamed forces continued to shape belief, now framed by angels, saints, and sacred order. The Mount stands not as a monument to replacement, but to transformation, where older meanings were not erased by Christianity, but carried forward under new names and new symbols. In the early 8th century, the rocky mount, rising from the tidal bay, was still an isolated and unsettling place, shaped more by legend and fear than by stone and order. According to tradition, it was here that Bishop Aubert of Avranches experienced a series of visions that would permanently alter the destiny of the site. The Archangel Michael, messenger and warrior of heaven, appeared to him with a clear command. A sanctuary was to be built on the rock. The story does not describe a gentle revelation, but insistence, repetition, and divine authority pressing against human hesitation. Aubert is said to have doubted the vision at first, uncertain whether the command came from heaven or from imagination. Only after the Archangel returned, repeatedly did the message become impossible to ignore. In the most striking version of the story, Michael marked Aubert physically, pressing a finger into the bishop's skull as proof of divine origin. Whether symbolic or literal, the image conveys a powerful idea. Sacred authority was not negotiated, but imposed. The founding of the sanctuary began not with confidence, but with submission. Once convinced, Aubert ordered the construction of a small oratory at the summit of the mount. The choice of location was radical. The rock was difficult to access, exposed to violent winds, and surrounded by tides that could cut it off without warning. Building there meant accepting instability as a permanent condition. This was not a sanctuary designed for comfort or ease, but for separation from the ordinary world. Elevation and isolation became part of the theology embedded in stone. The dedication to Michael placed the new shrine within a wider Christian geography. Across Europe, sanctuaries to the Archangel appeared on mountain peaks, cliffs, and borderlands. Michael was not a gentle intercessor, but a guardian of thresholds, a figure associated with judgment and cosmic order. By claiming the mount in his name, the Church reframed the dangerous landscape as a place under divine command rather than uncontrolled natural force. The tides still ruled the bay, but they no longer ruled its meaning. As devotion to the shrine grew, pilgrims began to arrive from across the region. Their journeys were shaped by risk and uncertainty, crossing shifting sands and racing tides. The act of reaching the sanctuary became a demonstration of faith, endurance, and trust in protection from above. The mount was no longer simply a rock with a chapel. It became a destination that tested belief before rewarding it. The story of the vision gave these journeys a narrative center, anchoring personal devotion to a shared sacred origin. Over the following centuries, the modest oratory expanded into a complex religious institution. Monastic life was introduced, and the sanctuary evolved into a major abbey, drawing royal patronage and intellectual prestige. Each phase of construction layered new meanings onto the original vision. Stone replaced wood, towers replaced simplicity, and ritual replaced improvisation. Yet the founding story remained central, retold to justify expansion and authority. The abbey's power rested not only on walls and wealth, but on the claim that its origins lay in direct divine instruction. The vision of St. Michael transformed a hostile landscape into a centre of order, discipline, and belief. What began as a private experience attributed to a bishop became a public foundation myth, shaping centuries of worship and architecture. The abbey that rose from the rock was more than a building. It was the material expression of a moment when heaven was believed to have spoken, and the world, reluctantly at first, was forced to listen. The island's most defining feature is not its stone walls or soaring abbey, but the sea itself. Twice each day, the surrounding landscape is radically transformed as the tide withdraws and then returns with striking speed. At low tide, the mount appears stranded in a vast, open plain of sand and shallow channels, seemingly reachable on foot from every direction. Hours later, the water surges back, cutting off all paths and restoring the island's isolation. This cycle of connection and separation has shaped every human response to the site. The speed of the tides in the bay is not gradual or forgiving. Water can advance faster than a walking person, filling channels that moments earlier appeared harmless. For centuries, travellers underestimated this movement and paid the price. The shifting sands hide deep pools and unstable ground, making the bay as dangerous as it is beautiful. Local guides develop detailed knowledge of safe routes, timing, and landmarks, passing this expertise across generations. Survival depended not on strength, but on understanding the rhythms of the sea. These tidal patterns gave the island a psychological power as strong as its physical one. The mount could feel welcoming and accessible one moment, remote and untouchable the next. This unpredictability shaped how people understood the site's meaning. Isolation was not permanent, but earned, granted only when the sea allowed it. The island did not simply stand apart from the world, it actively withdrew from it, reinforcing the idea that entry was conditional and never guaranteed. For religious communities, the tides became part of spiritual discipline. Monks lived with constant awareness that the sea controlled movement, supplies, and communication. The water enforced silence, confinement, and dependence on preparation. Time was measured not only by prayer and bells, but by the return of the tide. This environment reinforced ideals of humility and order, reminding those on the mount that human structures existed at the mercy of natural forces. Pilgrims experienced the tides as a test. Crossing the bay required patience, attention, and trust. Misjudging the moment could mean being trapped or drowned. The journey stripped travel of comfort and certainty, turning movement itself into a ritual act. Reaching the island after such a crossing intensified the emotional impact of arrival. The abbey rising from the rock appeared not just as architecture, but as refuge and reward. The tides also shaped the island's defensive strength. During periods of conflict, the surrounding waters acted as a natural barrier, more reliable than walls or weapons. Armies found their movements restricted by the same forces that challenged pilgrims. Timing attacks required mastering the sea, and failure often came quickly. The island's security rested not in constant separation, but in controlled access dictated by nature. Even in the modern era, despite causeways and engineering, the tidal rhythm continues to define the island's identity. Efforts to preserve the natural flow of water reflect an understanding that the mount loses meaning if it is permanently connected to land. The island remains powerful because it disappears and returns, reminding observers that it exists in a state of tension between presence and absence, stability and motion, human intention and the authority of the sea. Building on Mont-Saint-Michel required more than faith or ambition. It demanded constant negotiation with a landscape that refused to remain still. Medieval builders were forced to work on a rock surrounded by water, wind, and unstable ground, where every mistake carried lasting consequences. There was no flat terrain, no easy foundation, and no predictable access. Stone, timber, food, and labour all had to be brought across tidal flats, whose conditions changed daily. Construction was never continuous, but shaped by pauses imposed by the sea. The mount's vertical form dictated a unique architectural logic. Instead of expanding outward, builders stacked structures upward, creating a dense, layered complex that grew over centuries. Heavy Romanesque foundations anchored the lower levels, designed to withstand both weight and moisture, while lighter Gothic elements rose above, reaching for height and light. Every level served a specific purpose, from storage and defense at the base to prayer and contemplation at the summit. Engineering and theology were inseparable, each reinforcing the other through stone. Foundations posed one of the greatest challenges. Builders had to carve directly into the granite rock, shaping terraces and platforms that could support massive walls. Drainage was essential, as rainwater and sea mist threatened to weaken mortar and stone. Channels were cut to guide water away from vulnerable areas, while thick walls compensated for uneven surfaces. Medieval engineers relied on experience rather than theory, learning through observation, failure, and adaptation to local conditions. The movement of the tides influenced not only access, but also design choices. Openings, gates, and lower structures were positioned with awareness of flooding risk and defensive needs. The sea functioned as both obstacle and protection, allowing builders to rely less on expansive fortifications and more on controlled points of entry. This reduced the need for large ground-level defences while reinforcing the mount's natural isolation. Cranes, pulleys, and scaffolding had to be adapted to confined spaces and strong coastal winds. Lifting heavy stones vertically required precision and coordination, especially on narrow ledges exposed to sudden weather changes. Construction crews worked in stages, often dismantling equipment only to rebuild it later, as new levels were added. The abbey was never a finished project, but an evolving structure, shaped by generations rather than a single plan. Living and working on the mount required logistical discipline. Supplies had to be stored carefully, anticipating periods when access would be cut off by water. Waste management, water collection, and food preservation became engineering concerns as much as architectural ones. Every system had to function reliably in isolation, turning the mount into a self-contained machine sustained by careful planning. The result was a form of engineering uniquely tied to its environment. The abbey does not dominate the seascape in spite of its challenges, but because of them. Its survival reflects an ongoing dialogue between human design and natural force, where success depended not on control, but on adjustment. Medieval builders did not conquer the living seascape. They learned how to build within it, allowing stone and sea to shape one another over time. War reached Mont-Saint-Michel not as a sudden interruption, but as a constant pressure that shaped its walls, rhythms, and identity. Although founded as a place of prayer, the mount could never ignore its strategic value. Rising from the tidal bay, isolated and difficult to approach, it naturally invited militarization. Over time, spiritual architecture was reinforced with battlements, towers, and gates, transforming the sanctuary into a structure capable of resisting violence without surrendering its sacred core. The abbey's defensive strength relied as much on geography as on masonry. The tides controlled access, turning the surrounding flats into a shifting barrier that confused enemies unfamiliar with the terrain. Attackers faced not only walls but time itself, forced to plan movements around the sea's return. The mount could not be surrounded in the conventional sense. Isolation protected it as effectively as any army, allowing defenders to conserve resources while invaders struggled to establish control. During the 100 Years' War, Mont-Saint-Michel became a symbol of endurance. English forces occupied much of Normandy, yet the Mount remained unconquered. Repeated attempts to seize it failed, blocked by narrow approaches, strong fortifications, and the constant threat of flooding. The abbey's garrison was small, but discipline and preparation compensated for numbers. Cannons battered the walls, leaving scars still visible today. But the defences held. Life under siege blurred the line between monastic routine and military vigilance. Monks prayed and copied texts while soldiers stood guard nearby, sharing the same confined spaces. Bells that once marked prayer also signalled danger. Faith did not retreat in the face of war, it adapted to it. The idea that the Mount stood under divine protection gained strength as each attack failed, reinforcing belief through survival. The defensive structures themselves reflected careful planning rather than brute force. Walls followed the contours of the rock, eliminating weak angles. Gates were layered, forcing attackers into narrow kill zones where momentum was lost. Towers provided visibility across the bay, allowing early warning of approaching threats. These measures were not improvised but integrated gradually into the existing religious complex, maintaining function without destroying meaning. Symbolism mattered as much as strategy. To defenders, Mont-Saint-Michel was not just a stronghold, but a sacred trust. Holding it became an act of resistance infused with spiritual significance. For attackers, its defiance was frustrating and costly, a reminder that some places could not be subdued easily. The Mount's survival elevated its status far beyond its size, turning it into a political and cultural emblem. Conflict left its marks, but it did not define the Mount entirely. When war receded, the abbey remained, shaped but not broken by violence. Its walls carried memory as much as stone, bearing witness to moments when faith and force stood side by side. Mont-Saint-Michel endured not because it chose war, but because it learned how to survive it without losing its identity. Daily life on Mont-Saint-Michel unfolded within strict limits, imposed by stone, sea, and discipline. Space was scarce, movement was controlled, and every activity had to fit into a vertical world carved from rock. For the monks, the Mount was not a retreat from labour, but an environment where work, prayer, and survival were inseparable. Bells structured the day, calling the community from sleep to worship, from study to manual tasks, in a rhythm as relentless as the tides below. Monastic life followed the rule of St. Benedict, emphasising obedience, stability, and balance between prayer and labour. Yet the realities of the Mount forced adaptations. Storage rooms, kitchens, and dormitories were stacked one above another, connected by narrow stairways that turned daily movement into physical effort. Silence was valued, but the sounds of wind, waves, and creaking stone were constant companions. The monks lived with a heightened awareness of their environment, knowing isolation could last for days when tides cut off access. Pilgrims brought a different energy to the rock. Their arrival broke the routine with movement, noise, and emotion. Many arrived exhausted, having crossed the bay on foot, guided by locals and driven by devotion. Some sought healing, others forgiveness, and others the simple fulfillment of a vow. The abbey provided shelter, food, and ritual structure, channeling the chaos of arrival into ordered experience. Pilgrimage turned the Mount into a crossroads of stories, languages, and social backgrounds. The town that grew below the abbey formed another layer of daily life. Craftsmen, merchants, and innkeepers supported both monks and visitors, operating within the same confined space. Streets climbed steeply, lined with workshops and dwellings pressed tightly together. Economic life depended on the flow of pilgrims and the timing of tides. Trade was seasonal and unpredictable, shaped by weather as much as demand. Food and water were constant concerns. Supplies had to be stored carefully to last through periods of isolation. Fish from the bay supplemented limited agricultural resources, while rainwater collection was essential for survival. Waste disposal required planning, with channels directing refuse away from living spaces. These practical systems were invisible to visitors, but vital to sustaining life on the rock. Education and record-keeping also played a role in daily routine. Monks copied manuscripts, maintained archives, and preserved legal and theological texts. Intellectual life continued alongside physical labour, reinforcing the abbey's reputation as a centre of learning. This work connected the isolated mount to broader networks of knowledge, ensuring it remained engaged with the wider medieval world. The architecture of Mont-Saint-Michel tells its story vertically, layer by layer, where each level reflects a different moment in medieval thought and technique. At the base, heavy Romanesque structures cling to the rock, grounded, defensive, and inward-looking. Above them rise the lighter forms of Gothic architecture, stretching upward with confidence and ambition. The Mount's silhouette is not the result of a single vision, but of centuries of construction shaped by changing ideas about space, faith, and power. The Romanesque foundations were built for endurance. Thick walls, small windows, and massive piers were necessary to stabilize buildings anchored directly into uneven granite. These lower levels carried the physical weight of the abbey and the symbolic weight of security. Romanesque design favoured solidity over light, creating interiors that felt enclosed and protective. On a mount exposed to wind, water, and attack, this architectural language made sense. It expressed permanence in an environment defined by constant change. As resources increased and engineering skills improved, builders began to aim higher. Gothic architecture introduced a different relationship with space. Pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses allowed walls to open and interiors to rise. Light became an architectural element rather than an afterthought. At Mont-Saint-Michel, this shift was dramatic. The Gothic sections appear almost to float above the heavier Romanesque base, transforming the abbey into a vertical journey from darkness to light. This contrast was not accidental. Romanesque and Gothic forms served different purposes within the same complex. Storage rooms, refectories, and defensive areas remained grounded and enclosed, while chapels and cloisters above were designed to elevate the spirit. The famous Gothic cloister, perched high above the sea, creates a sense of calm suspension, where slender columns and open arcades frame sky and horizon. The physical ascent mirrored a spiritual one. Construction methods had to adapt as styles changed. Romanesque builders relied on mass and compression, while Gothic builders depended on balance and precision. On a narrow rock with limited space, these techniques required extraordinary coordination. Buttresses had to be positioned carefully, loads calculated through experience rather than mathematics. Errors could not be easily corrected. Each new level depended entirely on the strength and accuracy of what lay beneath it. The coexistence of styles also reflects institutional continuity. The abbey was never demolished and rebuilt from scratch. Instead, new generations worked with what they inherited. Romanesque walls were reinforced, repurposed, and sometimes hidden within later additions. Gothic elegance did not replace Romanesque strength. It relied on it. The Mount's architecture became a physical archive of medieval priorities, preserved in stone rather than text. By the late medieval and early modern periods, the religious influence of Mont-Saint-Michel began to weaken as pilgrimage routes shifted and political priorities changed. The abbey remained impressive, but its central role in spiritual life slowly eroded. Fewer pilgrims made the dangerous journey, and monastic discipline declined along with financial support. The Mount, once animated by constant ritual and construction, entered a phase of quiet stagnation. The French Revolution brought a sudden and brutal transformation. Monastic life was abolished, and the abbey was stripped of its religious identity. Sacred spaces were emptied, symbols removed, and centuries of spiritual continuity were broken in a matter of years. The Mount was repurposed as a state prison, chosen precisely because its isolation made escape nearly impossible. What had once been a place of devotion became a tool of control. Prison life reshaped the abbey's interior. Cells were installed within former chapels, iron bars cut across windows, and walkways were reinforced to manage inmates, rather than monks. The vertical structure that once guided spiritual ascent now enforced confinement. Prisoners lived under harsh conditions, surrounded by stone and sea, cut off from the mainland as completely as the monks once had been, but without the sense of purpose that had defined monastic life. The Mount's new function damaged both its fabric and its reputation. Architectural details were neglected or altered, and the abbey came to symbolize repression rather than reverence. Yet this very use prevented total abandonment. Continuous occupation, even as a prison, spared the structure from collapse. Ironically, the institution that erased its sacred role also ensured its survival. During the 19th century, attitudes began to change. Writers, historians, and artists rediscovered Mont-Saint-Michel as a monument of national heritage. Romantic fascination with the medieval past transformed public perception. The prison became increasingly controversial, viewed as an insult to the site's historical and cultural value. Campaigns for its closure gained momentum, driven by a growing sense that the Mount represented something far larger than its current function. The prison was finally closed in 1863, opening the way for restoration and reinterpretation. Architects and scholars began the slow process of removing prison structures and stabilizing damaged sections. Restoration was not an attempt to return the abbey to a single moment in time, but to reveal its layered history. Each phase of the Mount's past was acknowledged rather than erased. Rediscovery turned Mont-Saint-Michel into a symbol once again, this time of historical memory rather than active religious power. Its identity shifted from living monastery to monument shaped by centuries of use and misuse. Decline, imprisonment, and renewal became part of a single narrative, showing how the meaning of a place can be lost, imposed, and recovered without ever being entirely destroyed. Today, Mont-Saint-Michel exists in multiple layers at once, shaped as much by imagination as by stone. It is no longer a functioning monastery in the medieval sense, yet it continues to project an aura of sacred authority. Visitors arrive not as pilgrims driven by vows, but as witnesses to a site that has absorbed centuries of belief. conflict, and reinterpretation. The Mount no longer demands devotion, but it still commands attention. Myth remains central to its identity. Stories of St. Michael's vision, miraculous protection, and unbroken resistance to invasion circulate alongside historical interpretation. These narratives are not treated as literal truth, yet they shape how the site is experienced. The Mount is approached as a place where legend and history overlap, where symbolic meaning is as important as documented fact. Myth does not compete with scholarship here. It fills the spaces scholarship cannot fully occupy. Memory is preserved through architecture rather than ritual. Every level of the abbey carries visible traces of its past uses, from Romanesque foundations to Gothic heights and prison-era modifications. Restoration efforts have avoided creating a false sense of uniformity. Instead, the Mount presents itself as a layered structure, inviting visitors to move through time as they move upward. The experience is physical, not abstract, requiring effort and attention. Modern conservation has focused on restoring the natural relationship between the Mount and the sea. Engineering projects have removed artificial barriers and re-established tidal flow, ensuring that Mont-Saint-Michel remains an island rather than a permanent extension of the mainland. This intervention reflects a modern understanding of heritage that includes landscape as well as architecture. The tides are treated not as obstacles, but as essential elements of the site's meaning. Tourism has reshaped daily life on the rock. Streets once defined by monastic routine and local trade now follow the rhythm of visitor movement. Shops and museums occupy former living spaces, translating history into accessible narratives. This transformation brings tension as well as opportunity. Preservation must balance economic reality with respect for authenticity, ensuring that the Mount does not become a stage set detached from its past. Despite crowds and modern infrastructure, moments of isolation still occur. Early morning light, retreating tides, and sudden fog can briefly strip away the present, revealing a quieter version of the Mount. In these moments, the continuity of place becomes clear. The same forces that shaped medieval experience, wind, water, height, and enclosure, remain unchanged. Mont-Saint-Michel today functions less as a religious centre than as a cultural mirror. It reflects how modern societies choose to remember, preserve, and reinterpret the past. Myth, memory, and heritage are not fixed categories here, but interacting layers that give the Mount its enduring power. It survives not by returning to what it once was, but by allowing its history to remain visible, complex, and unresolved.